Okay, so yeah, so welcome to our last session before our mini break, and we're really excited to have Lee Bickmore present with us and also online on SALN. And Lee is a longstanding associate with the department who's been really a great associate who's really maintained his relations, who's been really invested in his relations with our university, and he's on his second visit to our university. He's spending 2 weeks with us this time. And meeting with students and giving this talk, and then we will all be together at Bantu 9 with, I think, quite a few people who are in the audience also, so that's going to be great. So I'm just going to make a couple of comments about Lee's background. So Lee got his PhD in linguistics from UCLA in 1989, working on a language of Tanzania, a Bantu language of Tanzania, and he's worked on Bantu languages, especially from Zambia, but also from Tanzania, obviously, and more recently, he's been working on Malawian languages. And I learned recently he has also done some work on Tahitian, actually, which he speaks, so not a Bantu language, in case somebody isn't clear on that. He has dozens of publications, articles. He has a very important book on Chilungu phonology. I have a very well-thumbed copy in my own office that I've referred to many times. He's also taken part in co-authoring a linguistics textbook with MIT that came out in 2017. And he has also very importantly been involved in a lot of African linguistics initiatives, especially open access and sort of more. So he's one of the editors for Language Science Press, so an important open access initiatives. For the ACAL Proceedings Contemporary African Linguistics Series, and he's been involved with ACAL, so that is the American Conference of African Linguistics that takes place every year, and it's one of the most important African linguistics conferences, and also a really important outlet for students, because there's been a sustained effort for over 50 decades, actually, at this point, to have the conference as affordable as possible and as accessible to many different scholars as possible. So Lee has been very involved in that, and he's also been a president of the more recently founded association. So for a very long time, there was a conference, but no association. And then this was formalized some years ago, and Lee has played a very important role in that. And I think this is where I'm going to hand over to him to present his talk. We'll just have to make sure that so let me share the slides and just hope. I might just need somebody to tell me if you can see everything properly. So we might have this issue again. So maybe just tell me if do I need to zoom into one page, because this is the PDF setup. So let me just change the scrolling. So okay, so hopefully everyone can read. Okay, and then I'm going to hand over to Lee. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Christina, for that very warm and generous introduction. It's great to be back here in Bloemfontein at the University of the Free State. And I want to thank the Department of Linguistics and Language Practice for having me here. Special thanks to Dr. Christina Riedel and the head of department, Cobus Murray, for facilitating my visit. Today, I get to talk to you about one of my very favorite topics, Bantu tone. I realize that tone can often be somewhat bewildering and challenging, even for phonologists and dedicated tonologists. It's definitely, you could say, an acquired taste. But I'll be talking about it today in a context that I think bears on some larger issues, such as the morphology, phonology interface. So hopefully what I have to say here will be useful to some of you as we think about how the modules in the grammar interface with each other. Okay, so can everybody see the handout okay? All right. So let me just move this real quick. All right, so since it's a tone talk, let me begin by giving you a couple of my very favorite quotes about tone. So the first is from Larry Hyman, 2014 paper, Tone Is It Different? He says, tone systems have properties which surpass segmental and metrical systems. I conclude that tone can do everything that segmental and metrical phonology can do, but that the reverse is not true. Since some tonal phenomena have no segmental or stress analogs, anyone who's interested in the outer limits of what is possible in phonology would thus be well served to understand how tone systems work. Then with regard to Bantu tone, a little bit more specifically, I draw from a quote from Chuck Kisselberth and David Oden, 2003, who say the close examination of Bantu tonal systems reveals patterns of extraordinary complexity. There are few other phonological phenomena as complex as Bantu tone. As a result, the importance of Bantu tone systems for the theoretical study of phonology cannot be overestimated. Okay, so those are some heavy words from some heavyweights in the field of tone. All right, so to begin the talk today, let me just review kind of what kinds of tones there are. So generally, people kind of can classify tones in two different ways. So there's lexical tones, and then there are grammatical tones, okay? So lexical tones are the ones that I think people are most familiar with. So if you think of the 5 different mas in Chinese, whether they're rising or falling or low or high, those are lexical tones. Bantu has lots of lexical tones. So I have an example here in 3A from Venda, where the roots and the nouns can either be low, 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 high, high, low, high, high. So all of this is specified then in the lexicon. Adjectives work the same way, as you can see from the Chilungu examples in B, and verbs work the same way, as you can see from some of the examples in C, all right? So the lexical classes all often have lexical tones associated with them. But those are not the tones that I'm going to focus on today. We'll talk about those a little bit, but the tones that I want to focus on today are of the other variety. These are what are called grammatical tones. In Bantu, we sometimes call them melodic tones or inflectional tones or affixal tones. These are tones that are added to a word as an exponent of the expression of some inflectional property or cluster of inflectional properties. So for instance, the tense, aspect, mood, polarity of a verb. So that's kind of, I realize a little bit fuzzy, people kind of scratch their heads on that. So the best way to understand grammatical tones, I think, is to actually see an example. So to do this, we're going to look at some verbs from Chilungu, which is a Zambian Bantu language. The structure of the verb stem, the structure of the verb, the whole verb is typical of other Bantu languages. It's given to you in 5 here. And so the thing then to understand is that Chilungu verbs, all Chilungu verbs basically come in 4 different flavors, if you want to think of them that way. So one of them, the simplest one, is where you don't have any grammatical tone. It's simply the lexical tones which are present. So in the example in 6A, in the present progressive, you have a single high tone on the subject marker 2. And then if you take a look at the final phonetic realization on the left, you basically see that the 2 is high toned and the following syllable as well, and then everything else is low. Now, the reason that following syllable is high toned is that there's a very productive rule of tone doubling in Chilungu. So any underlying lexical high is going to spread over 1 tone bearing unit to the left. So this form in 6A, very straightforward. If we turn though next to the form in 6B, this is the recent past. If you look at the underlying representation, you've got high tones on a couple of the prefixes, but the whole stem is low tone. This is one of the low tone or toneless verbs, okay, sukilil, to accompany. Yet, as we look at the phonetic realization of this form, you can see a high tone surfaces on the second tone-bearing unit of the stem, and then spreads 1 to the right. So what we have to say here is that if you want to construct the recent past in Chilungu, you put on these 2 prefixes, you put on the ile suffix, and in addition, you need to add a high tone to the form and associate it to the second vowel of the stem. That high tone is a grammatical high tone. It's not a lexical high tone. It's not part of any verb root or tone root or adjectival root, but it's thrown in to help express the tense. Now, you might think to yourselves, okay, that's not too complicated. So some tenses you throw in a high tone and you link it to the second tone bearing unit. Not so fast. We go to the example in C, and what we see there is that there's a grammatical tone that's inserted into the form. But this time, it's not associated to the second tone bearing unit, but to the final tone bearing unit. So some of the tenses, like the recent past, have this grammatical high associated to the second mora. Some tenses have this grammatical high attached to the final mora. Okay, and it's kind of arbitrary. There's just a list of tenses that do one thing and a list of tenses that do another thing. It's not like, oh, all the past tenses work this way and all the futures work that way. No, it's a hodgepodge of tenses. It has to be basically memorized by the speaker. But there's yet a third category. So if you take a look at the future tense in D, what we see there is that the high tone, this grammatical high, doesn't just associate to the second mora, doesn't just associate to the final mora, but associates from the second through the final mora. Okay, so that's the third pattern. So Chilunga basically, to recap here, comes in, all the verbs come in 4 different flavors. One with no high tone at all thrown in, no melodic tone, no grammatical tone, and then 3 different cases where there are grammatical tones, but they dock to different places in the stem. And the speaker has to somehow do all this, okay? All right, so at the end of their presentation of melodic tones in Chichewa, Downing and Tenje in their 2017 excellent grammar of Chichewa asked the question that I want to examine here, which is where in the grammar are the grammatical tone patterns represented? And the response is interesting. They say here, the issue has surprisingly received no attention in the literature on Bantu morphosyntax, as far as we know, and relatively little attention in the phonology literature analyzing grammatical tone patterns. They continue, as we can see, the answer to this question is not obvious, since a combination of factors can determine the choice of the tone pattern. So let me just be clear here. They're not saying that there are not excellent descriptions of the tonal patterns and how grammatical tones get manifested in a number of Bantu languages. There are, and there have been for decades. But what they are saying is that little attention, nobody actually wants to kind of ask the question, well, like, where are these grammatical tones generated and where are they linked? So just real briefly to set up the talk, we have the morphology component, right? And that's an input to the phonological component. Are these grammatical tones generated and linked in the morphology? Are they generated and linked in the phonology? Or are they maybe generated in the morphology and linked in the phonology? That's the question that I'm trying to address today. So what's obvious here and what's not? If you look at the various descriptions of melodic high tones in various good grammars, you conclude that both morphosyntactic / inflectional information, as well as phonological factors, and we're going to get to both here in the talk in just a minute, are at play in the realization of melodic tones in Bantu. What's not so obvious is, assuming a model where the morphosyntax precedes and feeds the phonological component, is it possible that the generation of melodic tones is done solely on the basis of morphosyntactic factors, and the docking and linking of the tones is done in the phonology completely on the basis of phonological factors? I mean, that would be very clean and very neat and very nice, but it won't work. And we'll show you that. Or does the very generation of the melodic tones in the morphosyntax sometimes need access to phonological information? And does the linking or docking of the tones in the phonology sometimes need to be sensitive to morphosyntactic factors? So those are the issues before us. All right, so in that vein, as is indicated in the title of the talk, I want to discuss 3 different proposals in terms of how one might tackle this question of figuring out how the melodic tones work in Bantu. So the first is called, I dubbed the all in the phonology hypothesis. And this one I don't think has a lot of currency in the field, so I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it, and I'll spend more time on the second and third proposals, which I think most people kind of assume some version of. So the first proposal, all in the phonology, is that melodic tones are not generated by the morphosyntax and are thus not present in the underlying representation. They are instead both added and linked completely in the phonology. But this seems suspicious, at least for Chilungu, as the melodic tone appears to be a morphological exponent of inflectional properties on par with the segmental affixes. So we saw, for instance, in the recent past, it triggers 2 prefixes and a certain suffix and the melodic high. So what would be the evidence to conclude that the segmental exponents of the inflectional category are introduced in the morphology, but the melodic high is not? Okay, so I put that on the table. It's a possibility, okay? But let us now move to the second and third hypotheses, which I think more people kind of assume. So the next one that I want to present to you is called the Annotated Tones hypothesis. This hypothesis, there are distinguishable different melodic tones generated by the morphosyntax, and then they get docked in the phonology. So for Chilungu, the distinct melodic highs need to be generated and assigned within the morphal syntax. And I show you in 10 then what the underlying representations would be for the recent past, where the high needs to dock to the second mora, the potential where the high needs to dock to the final, and the future where the high needs to dock from the second through the final. And so what I've done here is I've shown you highs with subscripts. So we have H, in other words, the grammar is generating, the morphology is generating 3 different kinds of melodic high tones. And I basically represent these here as H sub I, H sub J, and H sub K. And this is basically the approach that I kind of suggested in my monograph. And then a number of tense aspect mood polarity combinations select for H sub I, some select for H sub J, and some select for H sub K. So then if you do this, that's kind of complicated morphology, but if you do that, then the phonology is real simple. And this is what we're going to see today as the theme of the talk is you're either going to have a complicated morphology and a simple phonology, or you're going to have a simple morphology and a complicated phonology. So the question is, which one of those is the best approach? So in this particular approach that we're on right now, the annotated tone hypothesis, the morphology is very complicated. But the phonology then is really simple, because once you generate these 3 different melodic highs, then the phonology just grabs the H sub I, links it to the second mora, H sub J to the final, and H sub K to the second through the final. So the pros here are that the phonological rules have no direct morphosyntactic conditioning, but the cons are that there's 3 different types of floating highs, which phonological rules are sensitive to. Now, since I did the monograph, there's been one approach in particular that I want to present to you today that falls under this category of the annotated tones. And that was done by Nick Rowley in his 2018 dissertation, where he introduces phantom structure. So that kind of sounds spooky, but I'm going to explain what that is. In addition to an underlying tamp consisting of segmental exponents and a floating high. It also contains some phantom structure, which is basically a plane linking, a plane containing tone-bearing units to which the underlying floating high can be indicated to be linked. So I show you, okay, that's kind of a fuzzy, nebulous kind of thing, hard to process. So I'm showing you an actual example here in 15. So in 15, let me show you this example of the Kikori, the very famous within Bantu. If you're a Bantu tonologist, everyone's familiar with the Kikoria inceptive. They become very famous in our realm, but let me explain it from scratch today. So you think to yourself, well, what's so special about this particular tense aspect in this language? Well, so the segmental part of it's really simple. It's raw. So you just prefix a raw onto the stem, and you can kind of see that. In this diagram that I have in 15, the white part is basically the underlying representation of the inceptive. So it has the prefix raw, but it's the second part that's the kicker, which is you have to generate a high tone and link it to the 4th mora of the stem. So if you think about this, especially for those of you kind of, familiar with kind of metrical docking sites, this is pure craziness. I mean, we're used to things docking on the very first part, the first mora of the stem or the last mora of the stem, or even the second, or even maybe the antepenult, but it's the 4th mora. Well, the way that Nick suggests handling this is with phantom structure. So the shaded part here is what he calls the phantom structure. And what it shows here is that this floating high tone, which is part of the underlying representation of the inceptive, needs to ultimately link to the 4th mora of the stem. So he assumes an optimality theory kind of approach here. And so what he says then is that the constraints then will ensure that the tonal associations in the output, the successful candidate, are faithful to and match the tonal associations in the phantom structure. So what I would say would be very, very easy to extend this to the Chilungu cases. So you can imagine phantom structure that says that in this particular tense aspect, the floating high attaches to the 2nd mora, in this particular one attaches to the final, or in this particular one attaches to the 2nd through the final. Okay, so this then is a summary that we'll return to of this approach, which I have dubbed the annotated tones approach. Okay, so now let's talk about the 3rd and final possible analysis of these Bantu tones, and that's what I dubbed the single tone hypothesis. So the single tone hypothesis, the way it differs from the previous one is that there's not different melodic highs, there's a single uniform melodic high that gets thrown in any tense aspect that needs it. So I show you then the underlying representations of the same 3 Chilungu verbs that we saw above. And you may be looking at this saying, wait a minute, isn't this exactly what we did before? No, because here the highs don't have any subscripts. So the recent, past, the potential, and the future all just have a plain old floating high. Okay, this simplifies the morphology. So you think, wow, yeah, this is a lot simpler. But then if you think about it, if all you're going to do is throw in those floating highs and they all need to link in different places, then that all has to be done in the phonology. So this third approach, simple phonology, complicated, rewind the tape, simple morphosyntax, complicated phonology. So in the phonology, then you're going to need three different melodic high docking rules, each of which is going to have a long list of tamp combos which trigger them. So for instance, in 18, I show you the rule, for instance, that is going to assign the melodic high to the final mora of the verb stem. Simple enough to say a floating tone docks on the final mora of the stem, but associated with that rule is a long list of morphological conditioning. So you only want to do rule 18 in the potential, the yesterday past progressive, the recent past, the perfect, affirmative subjunctive, yada, 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 keeps on going. And there's going to be kind of 12 different, combinations that trigger this rule and 12 different combinations that trigger the other two rules. So you could certainly assume that the a co-phonology approach, so that there was one for no melodic high and one for each of the three melodic high patterns, and then each co-phonology is going to have a long list of tamp combos which trigger it. Okay, so we then ask the question, okay, let's pause for a second. We think we might be able to...
No, I just want
just to make sure. Okay, all right. Okay, very good. Okay, good. So things aren't going to shut off automatically here. We're going to be good for the rest of the talk. Okay, so you then are asking the question, okay, well then which approach is right? And that's a natural question to ask at this point. Well, I will say this, either approach works fine for Chilungu. So for the data that we've done so far, either approach is okay. But Chilungu, even though it's one of my favorite Bantu languages, there's lots of other Bantu languages, hundreds of other Bantu languages. So if we're going to kind of get to a place where we can evaluate which of these two approaches is better, we need to look at a lot more languages. Okay, so in order to be able to explore the difference, we're going to need to look at a bigger range of factors that determine whether melodic tones will be present and their docking pattern. So to do this, I'm going to reference a 2014 thematic issue of Africana Linguistica that David Oden and I edited, where we invited people to write articles about the Bantu language that they worked on and how the melodic tones work. So we ended up having people write about 28 different languages from a dozen countries in a dozen Bantu zones. And so if you're interested in these and their references, they're here listed in 22. So I'm not going to dissect each one of these. Let's not worry about that. You want to know kind of the executive summary. So for somebody that looked at all those languages in the volume, what have you concluded with regard to what factors influence the generation and the docking of these melodic tones, these grammatical tones in Bantu? Okay, the very first thing and the most common thing you find is that the tense aspect mood helps to determine where to dock these tones, right? I mean, we saw that in Chilungu. Progressive works differently than the future, works differently than the recent past, right? So the tense aspect mood is always a factor. But is that the only factor? I mean, if I were to stop the talk now and having introduced just the Chilungu, you would think, okay, what I learned today is that in Bantu, there are these grammatical high tones and it's dependent upon what the tense aspect is as to where you dock it. Absolutely true for the data that we've looked at so far, but it turns out that there's a lot more factors that help to determine where these melodic tones dock. The next one is polarity. Whether the verb is in the affirmative or the negative can have a drastic effect on where you dock these tones. The next one is subordination and relativization. You can have the exact same verb, and in a main clause, the grammatical tones dock one way, and in the relative clause, they dock another way. Okay, and it might depend if it's a subject relative or an object relative. It's super interesting. A focus, as well as the conjoint disjoint distinction in a number of languages, help to determine where the high tones get docked. The presence of an object marker. Okay, so Bantu, right, has the slot for object markers, and the presence of an object marker can help determine where the grammatical tone docks. The subject marker, the kind of subject marker, is it a third person singular? Is it a first person plural? Those can help determine where the melodic highs dock. Whether there's a reflexive prefix present or not helps to determine Indications of motion. So these verbs that, you know, kind of have a notion of go or to come in them can help determine where the high tone docks. Even just the very presence of verbal extensions in some languages help to determine. So there's a lot there. I mean, that's almost the entire kind of inflectional world of the Bantu verb. Almost any aspect of it, of the morphosyntax of the Bantu verb, can help determine whether a melodic high tone is generated and where it docks or not. Okay, so then let's ask the question, because this whole time I've been talking about morphological properties and phonological properties. So I've just given you the executive summary from that thematic volume of Africana Linguistica that lists all of these. I'm focused up to this point on all the morphological factors that can help determine. But the important question in 32, in addition to the many morphosyntactic factors enumerated above, are there also phonological factors which help to influence the melodic tone realization? And the answer is absolutely yes. So let us return to Chilungu. So what I showed you in 33 through 35 are some Chilungu verbs in the perfect, right? And so the generalization about Chilungu is that in the perfect, you always have a grammatical high present. But what's interesting, unlike the future, where you have a grammatical high and it's always docking to the same place in every possible future form, in the perfect, you actually find all three patterns of docking of the melodic high. So I show you in 33, A through D, 4 different verbs where the pattern is the melodic high docks onto just the second mora. I show you in 34 verb forms where the melodic high just docks onto the final. And I show you in 35 forms where the melodic high docks onto the second through the final. Now, I could give us a little bit of a, you know, break here and everybody can kind of examine these or whatnot. I'm going to kind of give you a chart that is going to kind of help us out here. So if you look at a chart in 36, you see the ones in yellow is where it docks onto the second mora, in gray, the second through the final, and in blue to just the final. And basically the upshot here is the following. In addition to having to know that it's the perfect, there are 3 other factors that help determine what melodic high pattern you get. Okay, so there's one inflectional factor, and that's the polarity. So you need to know whether it's affirmative or negative. But there are 2 phonological factors. So whether the root verb is high or low, okay, makes a difference in what docking pattern you get, and whether the subject marker is high or toneless also plays a role. Okay, so now we've introduced phonological factors. So in other words, in order to answer the question, well, where do these grammatical highs dock in the perfect tense in Chilungu? You not only have to know whether it's an affirmative or negative verb, but you have to tell me, is the root high or not? And is the subject marker high or not? So those are phonological factors that are playing a role. So what I show in 37 is, okay, so we can ask the question now, so how would your 2 hypotheses deal with this? So in 37, the Annotated Tones hypothesis, I put here, for those of you that can kind of see the handout here, the morphological factors are in green and the phonological factors are in red. But in the morphosyntax, you basically have both phonological factors and morphological factors that are relevant in order to know if a melodic high is going to be generated and where it's going to land. And then in the phonology, it's pretty simple. So you just link the rules sensitive to these annotations, for instance, that phantom structure. In the single tone hypothesis, the morphosyntax is pretty easy. All perfect forms just generate a melodic high. But then the phonology is really complicated. So the phonology then has to know both inflectional factors like the tense aspect, the polarity, as well as phonological factors like the tone of the root, the tone of the subject marker. So to summarize here, in 30, 39, and 40, in the annotated tone hypothesis, both morphosyntactic and phonological info is accessed in the underlying representation. And then, but no morphosyntactic information is needed in the phonology, just faithfulness to the phantom structure. In the single tone hypothesis, just morphosyntactic factors are relevant for the underlying representations, in the morphosyntax, but in the phonology, both morphosyntactic as well as phonological information is required to link the melodic tones. Okay, so again, this is the running theme here. We've got the 2 proposals. One of them has kind of a complex morphosyntax and a straightforward phonology. The other one has a very straightforward morphosyntax, but a complex phonology. So what I want to zero in on now is the following, 41. If we look at the single tone hypothesis, right? So the claim is here that the morphology can be real simple. But is that really true? Is it going to be really the case that as we look at a lot of different languages, that the single tone hypothesis could have a very simple morphal syntax where only inflectional properties were used to generate the melodic tones? So is it the case that the single tone hypothesis does not ever need reference to phonological information? That is to say that melodic tones can be generated solely on the basis of morphosyntactic and inflectional factors, and that it is just the linking of the melodic highs in the phonology that would be sensitive to phonological factors? Or, this is the big question for the remainder of the talk, are there cases where the morphal syntax actually requires some phonological information just to correctly generate melodic tones in the first place? Okay, so enter Lala, which is a Zambian Bantu language, somewhat close. It's an M language, somewhat closely related to a Chilungu. And fortunately, it has the same set of melodic high patterns found in Chilungu. So you don't have to memorize a new set. It's the same ones, either no melodic high on the second, and Mora, or melodic high in the final, or melodic high on the second through the final. All right, just 1 second here. Okay. I was just checking, I saw that there was something in the chat, and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't somebody claiming that the video had gone out or something. No, we're good. Okay, so let's see here. In Chilungu, we find that some tams never have any melodic highs and others always do. Though an individual tam like the perfect can exhibit multiple docking patterns depending upon other factors. And while this is generally true for Lala, it is not always so. So just as the perfect was a really interesting tam in Chilungu, let's turn now to the perfect in Chilala. And what it turns out is that verbs with toneless roots have no melodic high, where those with high toned roots have a melodic high, which docks onto the second mora through the final. So the form in 43A is very straightforward. You take a look at the underlying representation, all the morphemes are toneless, and it doesn't look like there's any melodic high, and the form comes out as all low. That's very straightforward. But if you take a look at 43B, that's where the root has a high tone. Here you actually need to add the melodic high, specifically the one that docks onto the second through the final, in order to get the correct phonetic result in 43B. Okay, so here's the question. If we're trying to ask the question under this approach, is it possible that the morphosyntax can be so simple in the single tone approach that it doesn't need any phonological information in order to generate the melodic high? That means for any tense aspect mood, you're either going to generate the melodic high or not. So if the morphosyntax generates melodic highs purely on inflectional factors without any recourse to the phonological properties of the form, then either both of these forms in Lala have a melodic high or neither does. But I think both of these possibilities are unsatisfactory. So if neither of these forms have a melodic high, then some rule or constraint in the phonology inserts a high tone and links it to the second through the final, just in the event that there's a stem initial high, okay? So in other words, insert the melodic high only if it would cause an OCP violation. This is very unusual. This would be not only the only high insertion rule in the language, but such a process is obviously a strange, highly marked phonological rule, flagrantly violating the OCP. Okay, so what about if we generate a melodic high for both forms? Okay, then the cophonology would trigger this, but the melodic high would need to then be deleted or left unassociated, just in the event that it was preceded by a toneless mora, but not a high toned one. So in other words, go ahead and insert the melodic high from the second to the final. Okay, in one case it causes an OCP violation, in one doesn't. Delete the one where it doesn't. That's very strange. Is Lala the only example of this kind in the literature? Turns out that it's not. So let's take a look at another one from Tura. This is a Kenyan Luya language described by Marlowe 2008. Has melodic high patterns accounted for by two docking rules. One docks it to the stem initial, mora, one to the stem final mora. And here there's no contrasting verb roots. There are some Bantu languages that don't have any lexical tones on the verbs, and this is one of them. So what we want to look at for our purposes here is just the negative imperatives. And there's two of them that are present here in 49. And you can see the one in 49A gets the melodic high and the one in 49B doesn't. And the only difference between the two forms is the tone on the pre-stem syllable. It's high in A and low in B. So in Marlowe's analysis of this pattern, the melodic high docks onto the first syllable of the stem and then shifts to the following syllable. But it only initially docks onto the stem initial syllable if the pre-tone bearing unit, the pre-stem tone bearing unit is high. If it is toneless, then it fails to dock. So folks, the summary here is have a melodic high, but only dock it if it would cause an OCP violation. That's what you're going to have to say if you always have the melodic high present or absent, just based on inflectional properties of the verb, but not tonological ones. Okay, the next example comes from Lagori, which is a Kenyan Luya language. It mainly exhibits melodic highs on the syllables that I show you here, but what's important is to look at imperatives here in 52. So we're back to a language that does have a contrast between high and toneless verb roots. So there's a high verb root in 52A and a toneless one in 52B. So Odin analyzes forms in 52A with high tone roots as having a melodic high assigned to the final mora and spreading leftward to the second mora, ultimately inducing deletion of the root high. For imperatives, though, such as 42B, he states toneless verbs, on the other hand, have no high at all. Well, if we're going to, follow this single tone hypothesis, which says you either have to have a melodic tone present or not, based on inflectional properties alone, not phonological ones, then we either have to say that a melodic high is generated in both cases, and undergoes unbounded leftward spreading. Then there would be a rule which deleted the multi-linked high just in case it does not violate the OCP. So again, we insert a melodic high, we spread it. In one case it causes an OCP violation, and the other it doesn't. We only delete it in the case that it doesn't. Very strange. So you get these strange rules. And then I don't need to kind of go into too much depth about the Tachoni imperatives in 55 that Odin describes, because it works basically, the upshot is exactly the same as what we saw in Lagori. Okay, nearing the end now, mercifully, right? One last fact about Chilungu, and then I'll conclude. In tense aspects in Chilungu that have the high tone prefix a, and two of them that have the combination of the a and the chi, you generally find the melodic high in the final vowel. So you would, generally you take a look at these and say, oh, this is one of those inflection constellations that require a high tone in the final vowel. But interestingly, just in case the subject marker is toneless, which happens in 3 classes, class 1, 4, and 9, then no melodic high ends up getting realized on the final vowel or anywhere else. And you can see these forms in 57. When I first elicited these, I was scratching my head. Wait a minute. Let me hear that again. There's got to be a high in that final vowel. And as we listen, all low, all high. The final vowel all high in the forms of 56, low in the forms in 57. If we take a look basically at one form with a high-toned subject marker and one with a toneless subject marker in 58A and B, what do we make of these? Well, Nick Rowley and I, in a recent article in Morphology, argue that this should be treated in the morphal syntax as phonologically conditioned suppletive allomorphy and not within the phonology as a phonological process. So if this is correct, this would be further evidence that it's probably not possible to make the generation of melodic tones completely blind to phonological structure. Because what we basically want to say is you generate a melodic high and link it with the phantom structure in the event that the subject marker is high. Okay, so that's phonology entering into the morphal syntax. Okay, and now finally we conclude. So a summary then of what we've seen here today, the annotated tone hypothesis. The generation of melodic tones in the morphal syntax must consider a range of inflectional properties of the verb as well as phonological properties. So this is the approach where the morphal syntax is complex. But then the phonology is simple. phonology generally does not need access to morphosyntactic information, but simply docks the tones according to the specified annotation. We contrasted this with the single tone hypothesis. And there, the generation of melodic tones in the morphal syntax in many Bantu languages, including Chilungu, is solely dependent upon inflectional factors and is phonology free. So for those languages, it's very viable. But in order for it to be completely free of phonological considerations in all Bantu languages, we end up having to posit linking or deletion rules in the phonology of some languages, and I've talked about 4 of them here, Lamba, Tura, Liguri, and Tachoni, which are typologically very strange, running counter, for instance, to normal OCP expectations or long distance reference to the tonal status of a particular prefix. But in the single tone hypothesis, if we then go to the phonology, it definitely is going to require access to both morphosyntactic information as well as phonological information in order to associate the melodic tones correctly. So I just conclude then by saying further research, good research into Bantu languages where these melodic tones are described with some detail can hopefully lead us to better evaluate what formal approach should be taken to account for their distribution. Thank you. Yes, so let me see, how do I want to get back here? Oh, I want to unshare for right now, maybe,
okay, yeah,
so I can see everybody.
There
we go. Okay, thank you, people present, and thank you for those that are online. So I guess we're open for questions now, is that,
yes, yeah.
Is that right?
We're open for questions and there's plenty of time. Also, there's something from Tara.
It's not. It was just something that I was thinking about. It's not. It's not
great.
something.
Hi, Tara. Okay, great. Thank you for posting that. I'll keep that in mind then.
So
I mean, but one thing that I keep thinking about.
Tara,
I don't.
Maybe repeat it for us because the I haven't been able to set up the screen in the venue where we're at. So only the people who are online have been able to read your questions. So if you would just. Or your comment, sorry, if you would just tell.
It's really not. It's really not important. It was just saying something specific in Totella. But the bigger thing that I'm thinking about, which I'm still processing this talk, so I don't really have an intelligent question. But I'm just thinking about the role of variation and how any of these systems kind of handle that sort of thing. Because it's, especially in Isindebele, which maybe somebody in the room is familiar with, we find like a tremendous amount of variation, and some of it is explained with contact but there's just so many factors. That's maybe the more macro question, but what's in the comments is not very important for everybody.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, the issue of variation with tone is always really important, and there's going to be language contact issues. And my hunch is that historically the reason we have all of these systems that have so many different factors is probably owes its source to variation in contact. So I guess what I end up thinking is for an individual speaker, we'll dig deep, we'll see what the patterns are, and in the event that there's some variation in optionality, say where a certain verb could be said in a couple of different ways and both are fully grammatical, then yeah, we'll have to deal with that. So yeah, it should be on all of our radars, anybody who works in this area. Yeah, thanks, Terry, unless you had a further follow-up on that.
No, and that wasn't even, I only spoke because I was asked about this other thing, but yeah, but that's what I've been thinking about. But in general, thank you for this great talk.
Thanks.
So I see Hilda is here. Hilda, do you have something about Fue that you want to add? Because I thought there was a question about that.
Oh yeah, thanks. No, not really. I was thinking based on Tara's comment about the negative stative being strange in Totella. Well, I'm not sure how it's strange in Totella, but in Fue it is a bit strange in the sense that it's the only negative that deletes all the high tones, lexical and melodic, and just adds a high tone and length at the end of the verb. So it's definitely the strangest negative tonal pattern that the language has. I'm not sure if that relates to the Totella data in any way, because what I've seen, Totella and Fue, despite being very closely related, have quite different tone systems.
No, that's very interesting. So let me ask a follow-up. I guess for the purposes of this talk, what I would want to ask is, in the case then, the unusual case, where you've got a verb form where all of the high tones end up getting deleted, is the characterization of that verb simply inflectional, like you were saying it happens in the negative, in the stative, or are there any phonological factors that also have to be taken into account to know whether all the highs get deleted or not?
No, so it only happens in a negative stative, but
Okay.
it also, if I remember correctly, happens in stative inflections that are not negative, affirmative statives that only have 2 syllables. So then no high tone is assigned, but if you have more than 2 syllables, there is a melodic high assigned to, I think,
Beautiful.
the second stem syllable. I'd have to check.
Yeah, I would love for you to send me that. I mean, these are the kind of cases that I'm especially interested in, are people who've done deep dives into their language where there's a little corner that's acting really kind of unusually, and what exactly is happening, and is that unusualness, is it due to purely inflectional factors, or are there prosodic, in your case, or more typical phonological factors that are affecting it? So the fact that it only happens, I think what you said, are bisyllabic stems, is very interesting. So when you have this written up, or if you already do, yeah, I'd love to have a copy of that. And it looks like maybe Tara has a follow-up on this very topic.
Yeah, I think, I unfortunately, my hard drive died and I haven't yet loaded my full Totella data back onto it, but it either also in Totella has to do with length, or verb height, or a combination, like lexical verb tone, or a combination of both of those things.
Great.
About how many different possibilities there are for tones in this eth ending. So
great, Tara. No, great. Yeah, I would love anything. Yeah, if you have something that kind of a paper that specifically addresses that, and I might even have it somewhere in my own hard drive, but resend it to me. That would be great.
Great. We still have time for other comments, questions.
Is it possible, Christina, to drop the PDF in the chat?
I was thinking we should.
We'll do this, and that way
remotely.
everybody can have a copy of the PDF. And for people here, I'm happy to kind of email you or make available the PDF of the talk. I realize some of it would have been very hard to follow without the visuals in front of you, that phantom structure. You're only imagining how crazy that must look. It's actually not that bad once you see it. So I'm happy to distribute the handout to anybody that needs it.
Sorry, I'm struggling to find a way to send a file. Actually, sorry. So maybe
Okay, so let's see.
we can just put it on the website.
Maybe. Let's see here. So, I see what you mean. Let's see here.
So if I type in the chat, it just doesn't give me the option. So it gives me the option to export the chat, but not the option to send.
Yes, I've had this issue before.
Also not quite sure why that's. Unless we try, but that's just screen sharing. So yeah, I'm not sure.
How about on the SALN site, on the website?
Yeah, we can. We'll
Okay.
just try and find another way of sharing it. That might be more convenient. Yeah, sorry.
Where the talk was posted and advertised, right, on your site, we can upload the PDF to that, and then everybody could just download it from there.
Yeah, I think that will be.
Okay,
yeah, so
that's the easiest way.
we actually have several websites, so we'll try and put it somewhere and then let people know where it is.
Okay.
And of course, Lee would also be happy to send it to anyone who has.
That's right. And some of you here might be just shy about asking your question. Email me, and I'm happy to kind of respond to questions that way too.
So I have a question, or a sort of question.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you wanted to say more about the phantom structure in more technical terms. I was just quite curious how it works. I mean, you said that it means the phonology is very complex, but if you don't mind, I would just be interested to hear a little bit more about how it works with other layouts and yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that the phantoms, so this again is kind of a suggestion or an innovation by Nicholas Rowley. he had took his dissertation. In fact, I recommend anybody that's interested, I know your question is a little bit broader, but anybody that's interested in kind of this issue of grammatical tones, his whole dissertation from UC Berkeley under Larry Hyman is about grammatical tones. And he looks at, of course, my favorite are the Bantu cases, but he looks at grammatical tone from, Mesoamerica and lots of different places. And yeah, in terms of the phantom structure, I would have to kind of go back to see kind of what all the constraints on it are. But it allows you to basically, and I don't think it would necessarily be limited to tone. I'm not sure if he talks about the use of the structure above and beyond tone, but where certain morphosyntactic, certain inflectional properties have some kind of phonological, implication that is going to, be important to be represented in the grammar. In some cases, he says it needs to be done in the morphosyntax, and the way to do it is to have this phantom structure, which can contain syllables and moras and also the tonal tier. I mean, it may be able, Christina, to also contain other tiers, maybe vowel height and other things, nasality, very possible, to show basically that, if you're, this tense, or if you're, negative polarity, or if you're in a subjunctive, or you're in a relative clause, then, this particular phonological feature needs to end up being realized in the stem, or before the stem, or after the stem, and the phantom structure is one way to do that. So that's not a great specific answer, but Nick does a good job of kind of going through the various possibilities in his dissertation. So for people who are interested in seeing that maybe could the phantom structure help me in my dilemma, in my language, particularly as it concerns inflectional properties having phonological consequences, it's a good place to look. Great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Are there any other comments or questions, including from the floor here?
Gobus.
So we have one question.
So, a general question. If one assumes that human beings always try to simplify their cognitive effort, why you did refer to historical language contact and so on, but why did languages evolve? What was the evolutionary advantage of languages evolving with these massively intricate structures?
Right. I'll make a small.
You might just want to summarize it for the.
Oh, I know people. So the question was, how did languages evolve such, a complex system such as the ones I've described today, when the purpose of communication, wouldn't something simpler do the trick? My hunch, Cobus, is that it started out historically much simpler. So these could have been in the verb form as kind of a redundancy. So just as an example, so for instance, if you want to do the future, it's possible then that you put the prefix la on, and as a kind of a redundant feature of the future, you make part of the stem high or something, or maybe all future tenses or something like that. So in other words, what you can, obviously we do this in English just with the segmental prefixes, but in languages, the Bantu languages, where the tense affix system, far exceeds the complexity, of English and related languages. Most Bantu languages have, 3, 4, 5 different past tenses, depending upon the time of day. Was it recent? Was it yesterday? Was it a long time ago? Same with the future. And it's possible that having a prefix as well as some tone indication as kind of a redundancy helped the listener actually know, okay, that's definitely the far future because, I heard one of these or both of these, but through time, these things got crazy. And, some of the highs dropped out, and with language contact, maybe, this person's future came into part of, this language's future kind of, maybe moved into some other language, and now that there's two, and then they have to figure out which one they're going to keep. So as a brief answer to your question, I think most tonologists would say that at least with Bantu, in Proto-Bantu, this would likely have been a lot simpler, that you wouldn't have seen all of these, crazy patterns like, if it's the affirmative and the perfect and a low subject marker and a high root, then do exactly this. That this has come about through lots of incremental steps of language change. And I think, as we know, sometimes language change, can simplify, and sometimes language change can, make things more complicated. So a partial answer perhaps to your question. Thank you for that.
All right, last chance for any final comments or questions. All right, then thanks everyone very much, both online and in person. And I think our next event is on the 22nd of July. You already have a list of our upcoming talks on the, it's always part of our reminder emails, right? So you got a reminder on Monday with the upcoming talks from July through September. So hopefully we will see all of you there, and thanks so much. And maybe some of you beforehand in Malawi.